to the cloud. Stop recording. Okay. Well, 3, 2, 1. Hey there, Tim Werner here from the Microsoft. Hey there, Tim Werner here from the Nashville Microsoft Azure Users Group. This is going to be an in-depth discussion on what it means to be a Microsoft Azure Cloud Solutions Architect. And guess who we have? The perfect person to talk to. Bill Zak, the president of the Nashville Microsoft Azure Users Group, and he's been a long-time Azure professional. Bill, how you doing, man?
Hey, good, terrific. It's great to be here. Thanks a lot for having me.
Oh yeah, for sure. In my role as a teacher, I often hear from people, some of whom are new to IT and are wondering about what it means to work in the cloud. Others, probably the majority, are actually seasoned IT pros or developers who see the writing on the wall with the public cloud and wonder, for instance, what is the day-to-day job of the cloud solution architect? So, Bill, my first question for you is super broad, and then the rest of them are going to be fairly constrained. Could you sum up your journey as a cloud solutions architect?
Sure. Well, I started as a developer originally, and I became a software architect. Back in 2007, I discovered a little internal Microsoft project that was eventually going to be called Microsoft Azure. So I always tell people I've been working with Azure since before it was called Azure. So yeah, I started, again, while I worked there, I played around with Azure and experimented with it and became, developed some proficiency in it. Then when it was launched in 2010, I was one of 25 people in all of Microsoft that were specializing in Azure. I left Microsoft in 2012 and then immediately was hired back by the Azure product group as a consultant through an external company. Spent another 3 years doing that. In 2013, I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, where I founded the Nashville Azure Group with 4 people. Today we have over 1,600 members here in Nashville. And Nashville's not a huge city, so that's a pretty good number. So like I say, I started as a developer. I always joke about having been a developer and then turning to the dark side, which is infrastructure. Okay, so I've been focusing mostly on infrastructure in Azure. Started working my way up, got certified, did a lot of the things you're supposed to do, and along the way developed kind of a passion for helping people adopt Azure and helping them adopt it the right way. I did a blog post at Microsoft which raised some eyebrows because the title of the blog post was, "Is Azure Adoption Too Easy?" And the point I was making is very easy to jump into Azure, take all the defaults, throw a virtual machine in Azure, and pretty soon you painted yourself into a corner. So I became a big believer in things like governance, and architecture, and doing things the right way, not the wrong way. So that's a little bit about my background.
Thank you. Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, as far as the cloud solution architect job role is concerned, Microsoft, as you know, is a dog fooding company. They use their own software. They have their own fleet of full-time cloud solution architects. In your experience and observation, how is the work of, say, a Microsoft employee who's a CSA different from someone who works for a Microsoft partner that's a cloud solution provider, let's say?
Yeah, I would say that Microsoft, because it's a big company and very structured, might have responsibilities to separated. Like for instance, in my company, for instance, what we've got cloud solution architects. We've also got engineers, and the engineers, in theory, the engineers do all the implementation. In practicality, the cloud solution architects do some of the implementation themselves, because sometimes there are new things that the engineers are not experienced with. For instance, in our company, we have engineers that do a lot with Azure Site Recovery, doing things like disaster recovery and migration. But there may be some things that are at the pilot stage, where we're doing something for a client where not only they, but we may not, our engineers may not have got a lot of experience in it. So cloud solution architects we do the design work and the architecture. We've got to be ready to jump in and do the actual implementation. And frankly, I like that part. I like doing implementation. I always have. Back in the early days, that's all it was, was implementation, along with the design. So.
To that point, it's different now with the pandemic, of course, but historically, if you're doing not only solution design, but some implementation, do you find that that's something you can do in your pajamas at home, or does it still require a road warrior orientation where you go to the client site?
Well, I've been very lucky. I've actually worked from home from a remote office for 14 years. Even when I worked back at Microsoft, I was remote, and I developed a discipline. Like I have to be at my desk dressed at 9 o'clock in the morning, even though
Hmm.
I don't have to be, because
Hmm.
it's part of the discipline.
Right.
About 2 or 3 months ago, I wrote a blog post on a few simple rules for working from home. And part of it was be disciplined, have to-do lists, manage what you're doing, manage your time. It's okay to, if you have to take a break in the middle of the day to do something personal, but act like somebody's watching you and just make up the time. Okay,
Hmm.
because time is precious and goes away very quickly. You lose it.
I agree. I think that's sage advice for anybody now who's forced into a work from home situation. It's not for everybody, is it? And discipline and having a regular routine, I found as a remote employee too, has been critical.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, I'm interested, you and I, before we talked, I mentioned this too. I'm really interested to know more about the Microsoft partner orientation. So you apply for a job as an Azure Solutions architect with a company who is in the Microsoft Partner Network. What is involved in earning that cloud solution provider designation? Is certification required? Is a certain amount of job experience required? What is your impression?
Yeah, a lot of certification is definitely a part of it, and having a number of enough employees that are certified. Becoming like a Microsoft partner. And there's different levels of Microsoft partner all the way up to gold partner. And there are certification requirements for that.
Mhm. In your experience, would a business that is a cloud solution provider partner be more of a managed service provider for a customer, or more of a, hands-off just helping with architecture, or does it totally depend?
I think it totally depends. Like, you could be a managed service provider. One of the advantages of being a CSP is you can actually sell Azure, for instance. So it's the CSP program actually started as a program for solution developers, that's with software to actually bundle Azure with their product or their solution. But it's gone way beyond that. It covers, managed service providers. Uh, so yeah, it's gone. I would say it's gone way beyond that. So, but there are requirements. In fact, Microsoft has a website that that lists all the requirements for becoming an MSP.
Great. Now, as you said, you've been with Azure since the very beginning and beyond, so you've got an incredible ability to see a long-term trend. What trends jump out to you when you think of the customers you've helped over the years in terms of their attitude toward Azure, their skills, their goals? What do you
Mhm.
think?
Well, I've actually helped companies at all levels of in their maturity of Azure. I actually did a blog post on the Azure maturity model, talking about based on the computer maturity model, based upon
Hmm.
whether they don't have a clue about the cloud,
Hmm.
all the way up to companies that have actually put a lot of things in Azure and maybe aren't happy with the governance, with how they've set things up and how they're managing the cloud. So it really depends. It really depends on the
Hmm.
client, their maturity. There's everything from, like I said, there's everything from don't know a thing about the cloud. My boss said I have to look into it. To I've done a pilot or I've done a few things. To we're doing a major migration, migrating 600 servers into Azure. To we're modernizing. If you're familiar with the Gartner maturity, the
Hmm.
Gartner model, it's
Yep.
modernize, modernization model. So there's different, and we have a large develop. In my particular company, we have a large development group too. So we do a lot of that work. We really kind
Hmm.
of, it's a, I don't, I'm not trying to give you a commercial on Red App, but it's
Mm-mm.
about a 250 person consulting company,
Hmm.
and started out in the hardware business actually, and then migrate through mergers and acquisitions, or got into the software business. Now I'm part of the modern data center practice, which is focused on cloud and predominantly Microsoft Azure. Again, I'm not trying not to make, make this a commercial for my company.
No, not at all. This is
Okay.
super high impact, valuable information. You use the term practice, and that's something I think of with Azure Solution Architecture. How is it when over your career you work for different practices? Do you find that a consultancy will develop its own set of best practices with regard to Azure architecture? How much does, say, the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework inform what a practice uses as their standard? Speak to that if you would.
Sure, sure. Yeah, companies do adopt. You know, when I love the term practice because
Mm-hmm.
I like to think about a law firm, and
Mm-hmm.
I like to think about calling clients rather than
Mm-hmm.
customers because it's a more professional designation. But companies do develop practices, and you know, most of them do in one way or another follow the cloud adoption framework that Microsoft has put out. And there's also another framework that came out recently called the Well-Architected Framework, which is kind of interesting. For instance, when I go into a client now and we lay down an Azure infrastructure for them to get started with, it's called
Mm-hmm.
a landing zone. And I thought that was a strange term, but I know that's a term from the cloud adoption framework that
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft uses very heavily.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating.
So,
And to that point, how common is it in your experience for businesses to make proprietary tooling, let's say, to help stamp out those standardized environments for clients?
yeah, it's very common. In fact, we have a set of PowerShell scripts where we can actually create a whole infrastructure for a client, everything from virtual networks to gateways to everything that you would have as I call it a starter kit, for
Mm-hmm.
your network. And for with other companies too, I've worked for, we have similar things like we have either ARM templates or PowerShell scripts or something that will actually bake in some good governance practices,
Yeah,
bake in things like tagging,
yeah,
things like
right.
policies, okay,
Mm-hmm.
things like alerts, which a lot of companies don't think about until it's too late.
Yeah, for sure. Here's a question that it's always fascinating to me. Let's say today your task is to think up a proposed solution architecture for a company. What tools do you use specifically? Do you use Visio, Lucidchart, PowerPoint, something else?
Mostly Visio. Visio is a great tool for playing what if. It's kind of a super whiteboarding tool.
Mm-hmm.
Where you can design it. You can design it. If the design doesn't work, you can tear it down and start over again. That's the nice
Mm-hmm.
thing about Visio. Uh, well, I've always been waiting for Microsoft to come out with a generator for Visio that would actually generate the
Yeah,
system based on the
right.
Visio design. But not
Wouldn't
there
that be
yet.
great? I remember years ago, Visio had a function that it could spider your Active Directory to
Uh-huh.
make a map of that. To do what you said, to create an ARM template based on a Visio diagram seems like a no-brainer. I don't
Yeah, yeah.
understand why Visio appears to be mothballed, you know?
Yeah. And there are a few people I think there are some third parties who've actually tried to do that. I just don't know what's happened to them.
Hmm,
I think it was
interesting.
too big a job probably.
Yep, yep. Now you've used the term "it depends" a few times, which is the go-to traditional consultant answer.
The architect's answer.
Along those lines, thinking more about the day-to-day for somebody that's interested in perhaps interviewing for a position as a cloud solution architect, how much does stuff like presentation skills, teaching skills, that kind of softer skills stuff fit into the job role?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the term soft skills because a lot of us grew up on the technology side and
Mm-hmm.
may not have great interpersonal skills, soft skills. For instance, you got to be able to communicate. You got to be able to communicate not only verbally but in writing. Like I've actually written a couple of books and some white papers and stuff, but that's important. It's not much different from doing good documentation to writing a book in my experience. So yeah, the soft skills are important. And one of the things that I really enjoy doing is mentoring people like engineers who may have a few rough edges where their interpersonal skills, are concerned. By the way, I've also done some training courses for salespeople on technology.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to kind of,
Mm-hmm.
bring the two sides together, I think. And you're right.
Well,
It's,
that's
the
something.
soft skills are really important.
I agree with you. I've always looked at this role and roles that are similar to this as almost at least in a way, a translator where you have to speak tech speak and business speak, and you need to be able to dynamically translate so non-tech people can understand what you're talking about. Tech people can understand some of the business stuff. It really is I'm
Yeah,
not going to,
you've really got to focus on the business problem you're trying to solve, right?
mm-hmm,
A couple of years ago, I used to do a presentation comparing Azure and Amazon Web Services
mm-hmm,
called A Tale of Two Clouds. And what I used to say is, both of those products have tremendously deep toolkits. So you should really focus on the business problem and your internal culture first before you start worrying about the technology you're going to use to solve the problem. Microsoft, by virtue of its nature of having been embedded in the infrastructure, and having been a big player in the infrastructure world, in my view, had the greater edge. Okay. But really, it's all about the business problem. It's all about, as an architect, I learned it's all about current state, future state, and the transition steps between the two. So that's really the approach I take: is where are you now? What are you doing? Where does it hurt? I guess like a doctor, right?
mm-hmm,
Where's the pain?
mm-hmm.
Okay, and then how do we get rid of the pain? Uh, and then migrate towards a better world. A world that's better managed, that's better governed, for instance. So it's really important. But it is the business. It's all about the business. We used to talk about, I think it was 15 architectural illities like reliability, scalability, and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. Well, cost became a much bigger factor when the cloud came along, because it's very easy, as to throw a bunch of stuff in Azure and wind up with a huge bill if you're not
Yep,
careful. So
yep.
it's an architectural consideration, cost. And I do a lot. By the way, one of the things I do is I do a lot of pricing for people to get budgetary approval for projects they're trying to do. So you can't
When you
escape
do
it.
that, when you generate pricing, do you use the public tools like the Azure Pricing Calculator or the TCO calculator, or do you go another way?
No, we use mostly the pricing calculator, although I have used the TCO calculator in times past. The problem I find is that the more calculators you use, the difference in results comes out. That you can't. Sometimes it's hard to reconcile one against the other. So you have to work hard to do that. But usually it's the pricing calculator.
Uh-huh. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, this is kind of a broad-ish question. Given that Azure is changing every day, what do you do and how do you stay current with Azure? How do you stay on top of things where you can pass that value to your clients?
Yeah, it's a really important question, one that I
Mm-hmm.
deal with all the time. Uh, Azure is huge. Azure's getting bigger and bigger all the time. And I always tell people, I've been working with Azure for over 10 years, and I don't know everything about Azure. But if you ask me a question I can't answer, I'll find out.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So it's all about spending enough time to keep up with Azure. I tell people that I spend approximately 2 hours a day keeping up with Azure.
Mm-hmm.
And people look at me cross-eyed like that's a lot of time. But when you think about how Azure is changing, it's really not.
Yep.
you know
Yep.
so 2 hours a day, things you haven't dealt with before.
Mm-hmm.
And there are areas of Azure that I'm not super competent in, like machine learning, for instance. But that's on my list. Okay.
Yes.
I
Uh-huh.
do a gaps list every couple of weeks, and I say, okay, what are the things I don't know that I need to know?
Mm-hmm.
Or what are the things I know a little bit about at a superficial level that I need to go deeper in?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, let's go a little bit deeper on that very question. Let's say you've identified that it's now time for you to get deeper on machine learning. Specifically, what kind of resources do you use to skill up? What do you do?
Well, this is going to sound like a paid commercial, and I apologize for that. But
No, no.
I've been using Pluralsight for most of my
Ah,
education for about 2013. So I've been
wow.
using it for a long time. I am lucky that one of the perks I get by running the Azure group is a Pluralsight subscription,
Mm-hmm.
for
Mm-hmm.
which I want to obviously thank Pluralsight. They've been great.
Mm-hmm.
That's my first go-to. That and Safari books online. I used to spend a lot of money on books, $65 a pop for a
Yeah,
technical book.
same
Now I
here.
have access to O'Reilly, all of O'Reilly, the books that
Mm-hmm.
O'Reilly has on Safari, plus
Mm-hmm.
Pluralsight. And those are really my main goals. There's a ton of information. In fact, one of the search tips that I'm always giving people is if you're looking up a particular topic about Azure, you'll
Mhm.
notice that when you go to a page in the documentation site, that there's a downloadable PDF on almost
Mhm.
every one. And
Yep.
that'll give you everything about that topic, more than you ever want to know about that topic. So I always tell people, yes, you can download that and search for the information you're looking at. Don't save it too long, because with given Azure the way it is, it'll
That's it.
change. All right. But people overlook that as a resource.
That's a good point. Yeah, because on one hand, the PDF is only going to be fully valid for a limited period of time. But on the other hand, because it contains the whole document library for that topic, you can control F to quickly find all occurrences of a
Yes.
keyword.
Mhm.
That is super valuable. I agree.
Yeah.
Um, Go ahead.
No, no, that's good.
My wife mentioned the other day she read in the news something called Zoom fatigue, especially now with the pandemic, with Zoom meetings or any kind of online meeting being the fact now. How much over, pandemic aside, just in general, in your career as a cloud solution architect, what percentage of your workday/week do you spend in meetings?
Um, Maybe 30–40% of my time. I spend a lot of time doing actual, it's going to sound funny, actual work. I didn't mean to make it sound
Uh-huh.
that way, but
Uh-huh.
doing architectural work and design work, working with developers. Uh, Before the pandemic, the approach, my day would normally consist of visiting a client for a few days, doing a workshop, teaching them about Azure, getting their requirements, and then coming back home and actually doing the work. Now it's 100% from home. So it's
Mm-hmm.
Zoom and Teams. Microsoft Teams are a very big part of that
Yeah.
day.
Uh-huh.
Okay. As you know from the Azure group, we've gone to an online meeting format only, and frankly, it's been less than totally satisfactory, because the networking part is missed.
Right.
The before the meeting
Right.
eating pizza and talking to everybody is missed. We're going to try to, this coming month, we're going to try to experiment a little bit with that and see if we've got at least a partial solution for that. So the human interaction is something that we miss. So, but that's again, I don't, that's pretty much it.
Okay.
Because I've been working with remote for 14 years. I'm used to the conference call, the video call approach to doing things with people. Still like to use video occasionally, although not all the time, to get to know clients, because you can't substitute the interaction. It doesn't substitute for the interaction that you would have if you actually went on site for a few days and met people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. That's a good
Yeah.
point. In general, in terms of day to day, you mentioned that you might, propose an architecture and another group of engineers may actually do the implementation, or you may do some or all of it yourself. So what does that look like? You meet with the customer and determine their requirements. And once you propose using Visio, say a topology, will you then pitch it to the client for their sign off? Do you do an internal review? What does that look like?
Well, we always do internal reviews, but we
Mm-hmm.
definitely get involved in the kickoff with the client and pitching
Mm-hmm.
it, going over the design, making sure that it's compatible with what they want to do. For instance, in one case recently, a client already had a significant investment in Azure. Uh, Thought about the idea of making them migrate totally from what they have now into a better infrastructure, but
Mm-hmm.
decided that a compromise would be appropriate, where you could have a hybrid architecture. So where they could eventually move things into Azure from their existing infrastructure. But it depends. The architect's answer, right? It all depends.
That sparks another question though, and that is, do you find typically that when a client wants to move such and so line of business application or workload from their local data centers into Azure, that they tend to want to start with virtual machines just because that's their mode of operation? Do you come in terms of offering alternatives with platform services, and how much does that conversation factor into your work?
And we definitely do both. But I think that it really, I hate to say this, but it really all depends upon who the client really is. Are they
Yeah.
the IT department? Are they the business unit? Sometimes they have a preconceived idea of what they want to do. Like, IT departments are operating under a mandate to get rid of the data center, or use
Uh-huh.
less of the data center and more of the cloud. In that case, you take an approach, well, okay, lift and shift first and then modernize, for instance.
Okay.
Or you could go right to modernization if they have a bread and butter application that they want to get into Azure. And maybe it could benefit from Azure SQL database rather than SQL Server in the cloud. If it's a web application, maybe it's app services, web apps. So there are really easy modernization approaches. I guess they call that Gartner calls that refactor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Part of the, lift and shift, refactor, that whole process that they've defined.
You mentioned the Gartner maturity model earlier, so that inspires the question, how many clients do you find nowadays are already adopting a DevOps methodology?
More and more as time goes on, but not enough, in my opinion. There's still, just like Agile, a lot of them have adopted Agile, but not enough. So sometimes it's hard to sell Agile, and sometimes
How do
it's
you
hard to.
fit into that? If a shop is already hardcore into DevOps methodology, how do you as a CSA fit into that machine?
Well, first of all, it depends upon which DevOps methodology they've
Okay.
adopted. If
Mm-hmm.
they're into Azure DevOps,
Mm-hmm.
capital DevOps, okay,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
or if they're into a GitHub type DevOps or some other DevOps, it really all depends. We've got to be able to adapt to their existing culture and their existing methodology, but we will hopefully we'll add nudge them in the right direction. I'm a big believer in Azure DevOps. I think it's just too bad they changed the name. I
Yeah.
thought that was a marketing decision.
Oh yeah, there's no question that from Azure DevOps to Microsoft DevOps is a clue
Yeah,
that we've got a melding of GitHub and Azure
sure.
DevOps. And Microsoft says themselves that all future innovation is starting in GitHub. And perhaps if the feature or product is popular enough, it may be backported to Azure DevOps.
Yeah, Microsoft's done a great job of acquiring companies and integrating them in. Some other companies, I won't name the other companies, but some other companies have acquired third-party products and companies and not really done a good job of integrating them. One of my favorite tools is Azure Site Recovery, which was the result of an acquisition of a product from a third party, and it's become totally integrated into Azure. We use it for migration, we use it for disaster recovery. So it's they do a great job of integration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, the idea of buying a company just to torpedo it to get it out of the marketplace, that makes me depressed.
Yeah, no, it's good.
All right, my last couple questions deal with people who want to be Azure Cloud Solution Architects. How experienced do you need to be before you'd say you'd qualify as even an entry-level Cloud Solution Architect?
Well, if you're starting out and you don't have a lot of hands-on experience, with Azure, then obviously Azure certification is really important. In fact, I know a guy who does a lot of courses for Pluralsight who has been publishing a lot of certification information lately, and it's really
Yeah.
cool. I haven't been going through the sessions, but I've been following what you've been doing, and you have a great AZ900 series out there, and there are other people like John Seville and other folks who've done a lot of publishing a lot of. There's a lot of free Azure education. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, I think
Mm-hmm.
I know at one time it's probably still true. At one time, Microsoft and Pluralsight used to have a deal where the Azure course, a whole series of Azure courses, was free. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if that's still
That's still
in effect.
going on, yeah. If you do a search for Pluralsight plus Azure, you can get to the landing page.
Great. And I always
Yeah.
tell people, that I meet in the Azure group who come up, we've got a lot of, like in Clarksville, we've got a military organization and we have a lot of people doing re-entry into,
Mm-hmm.
into technology from the military. We get a
Mm-hmm.
lot of those people, we get some of those people at our
Yep.
meetings, and I always tell them to check out those courses.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm a big believer, like I said, in Pluralsight. Not a commercial. You didn't pay me to say this. Okay.
No, I totally agree. I mean, in my experience, to be successful in IT in general, you need to always be learning, but that's triply the case when it comes to the cloud and Azure in particular.
Yep, I agree.
So
But you
last
can,
question.
the other thing is
Mhm.
read a lot, and
Yeah.
you know, if you come across something that you don't know, dig into it, at least at a high level. Try to get at least a, you know, a general background. You know, architects, people joke about architects only being able to deal at the 200,000-foot level. So you've really got to get a good overall broad feeling. Look at things like the Azure Architecture Center for Design Patterns, for instance. Cloud adoption framework is important. I think Microsoft's done a lot of work on that over the years to, you know, to give people good guidance, and there's a lot of good guidance out there. And look at other systems that people have implemented and how they've implemented them.
Hmm. Yeah, in fact, um, to our viewers, if you're watching this on YouTube, which I presume you are, I'll put links to all of Bill's blog articles, all these references that have come up over the last half hour, because it's a good collection for sure. And I want to make sure you have those. My final question is, whether a person is newish to IT, and like you said, they're studying for certifications and really digging in, or maybe you're already been in IT in some role or another, what tips and tricks do you offer for getting your first break? Because isn't that what it boils down to? When you want to break into a new career, you need a company that's willing to take a chance on you. Any advice, words of wisdom on how you can get your big break into cloud solution architect job role?
Standard architect's answer, it all depends. Okay, but I can only tell you that you know, like here in Nashville, we have the Nashville Software School, which, you know, a
Hmm.
lot of people, career changers and people who are, you know,
Hmm.
who are moving on, go to, and they do Azure, some Azure training, you know, as part of that, so you can get some hands-on training with Azure.
Hmm.
And frankly, if no other way, just play with it yourself. You know, you can get a free subscription to Azure, get a $150 or $200 a month for free Azure for a month, and, you know, learn that way. There's a lot of tutorial material out there. That, you know, the Microsoft documentation site has tutorials, but it's becoming less and less of a problem because more and more companies are actually adopting Azure. So chances are your company is already using it in one way or another.
Hmm.
So maybe you
Yeah,
can get it, horn into an Azure project somehow
there you
and
go.
become certified. Becoming
Mhm.
certified means the recruiters will come after you like crazy
Okay.
nowadays. So
All right, so I'm hearing that you're going to maximize your chances in the job market, A, by focusing on skilling up,
mhm,
education, training, taking advantage of all of those, potentially adding one or more Azure certifications to your resume, which I submit is going to be another way to
mhm,
differentiate you from
right,
competitors, and actually certification may be required if you want to
right,
work for a Microsoft partner CSP, let's
sure.
say.
And you recall Tim, you did a talk for the Azure group a couple of months ago on how to skill up and how to, you know, how to
Mm-hmm.
stay current with Azure.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you another plug for our YouTube channel. The
Mm-hmm.
Nashville Azure group has a YouTube
Mm-hmm.
channel. You can post a link to it, you know, with this if you want
Yep.
to. And you did a good job of covering this whole gamut of things, focusing on, you know, how you keep up, get up to date, how you develop skills with Azure, and how you keep up to date. Because there's a lot of things happening, and there's some pluses and minuses to keeping up to date. Like I know there's been some drastic changes in certification requirements recently. There's you know, obviously in a fast changing field like Azure, it's sometimes difficult to keep up, but it's part of the fun, actually, I think. Part
It
of the
is.
challenge.
I like the challenge. I like to solve puzzles.
Yeah.
So yeah, and in that talk, I believe I mentioned professional networking. And I've found that to be extremely important. And it ties in, I think, with our subject of breaking into the field and getting that first break. And it's a shame, like you said, Bill, about not being face to face at the user group lately, because that professional networking can definitely make the difference in somebody's career, an opportunity that they may have never known existed, or a recruiter who never knew this candidate existed if it weren't for this chance, meeting at a user group.
Sure. Yeah, my joke is that it's not all about the pizza.
Yep, yep, absolutely. It's the full picture.
Yeah.
Any closing thoughts, Bill?
No, just that to anybody who's who's interested in a career in Azure, I'm always willing to give people advice or help. I love to mentor people. That's a lot of my time with engineers is spent mentoring them, and I'm pretty good at I call it culling resources from the thousands and thousands
Mm-hmm.
of blog posts that are out there. So if
Mm-hmm.
anybody has a question related to Azure, I do not claim to know everything, but I think I know how to find out. So just I'd be happy to help people. Okay.
Fantastic. Well, make sure to include your contact deets in the description section of this video as well. Well, this has been, from my perspective, super impactful, and I know a bunch of other viewers are going to agree. Thanks so much for sharing your experience and wisdom with us, Bill.
Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Bye now.
Sweet. Let me stop recording. Do you want to
So that
stop
was
the
fun.
record?